in a bit of a thermal break. And I agree with Matt, like make sure that you have as much drying potential as possible to the inside.
I was thinking like just not putting anything in the cavities except maybe a bunch of packets of like silica gel and then using...
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Deputy Editor Matt Milham.
How's it going?
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you too.
Editorial Director Brian Pontalillo.
Hey, everyone.
And our amazing producer, Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Hey guys, it's good to see you this morning. How y'all been?
Doing all right. A lot of snow clearing. It's still snowing. Woke up early. Snow blew my driveway because I got to go to the office later. But
what are you going to do there?
Just print out some stuff for issue we're working on, a deck sip, and pick up some nailers that are left there.
I think folks would be surprised to hear that in this modern day and age that we still feel compelled to print out things to review them. But like you, Matt, I find different stuff when I look at things on the page versus when I look at them on the computer monitor. Do you guys think that's true?
Well, yeah, there's a bit of that, but also, like if I'm looking at the code book and looking at something that also is on the screen, when you're clicking between things to try to fix things, it's really hard when you're working on a small monitor. So it's just a lot easier to have the code book next to a piece of paper on the table and just look across and make sure the tables are right and update stuff. So, yeah.
What do you think, Brian?
I agree with you, Patrick. I would much rather look at something that really needs, close attention on paper. And also, we're making a print magazine, and it's important to see it how it's going to be seen.
Yeah. We, pre-COVID, before a magazine would go to the printer, we put the entire thing up on the cubicle wall, right? And you look at it in its entirety. And I tell you, that's one of the things I miss most, because you start to see, silly repeated things that you might not see when you're looking at things piecemeal, right? You see a more global perspective. And that's definitely one thing I miss since we've had to change our workflow.
Yeah, I had sort of for years and years, I had sort of a morning routine. Once the issue started going up on the wall, I would kind of come into work and I'd go into my cubicle and turn everything on, and then I'd head towards the coffee pot. But I'd stop on my way, either on my way there or my way back. I'd stop and I'd duck into the conference room and take a look at what was up for the issue. And I would just kind of keep doing that. And, over the course of the time that it took us to put together an issue, like lots of things would just sort of like ideas would just sort of spark from that, Yeah, I miss that too, Patrick.
I've been busy here around the house. I think, so Jonathan, our longtime listener and friend, interviewed me for our first anniversary special podcast. And I decided to go first just to set an example so folks know what to expect and are more willing to get on the hot seat. But anyway, I figured if I told him my next project, it would force me to do it. And that was painting the living room. And that's what I did this past weekend. We went from the Builder Band-Aid to this lovely mint green color. And Carol and I worked our butts off to get it done, but boy, it was satisfying once we're finished, and it looks so much better.
Mint green, huh?
Mm-hmm. You guys know Andy's Candies? It's like a dark chocolate.
Oh, yeah.
And it's got a green layer in between, right? Uh-huh. It's very much like that green layer.
Man, that sounds very 50s.
Wow.
That sounds like the tile that's underneath the crappy sheet vinyl that's in my kitchen right now.
Wait till you see my 57 Eldorado, man. You're going to love it.
Yeah.
In our last house, we had really kind of an open living space. And when that I had opened up, and when it was time for paint, we decided to make it kind of colorful. And we had used a couple of blues and a couple of yellows. And when and then I kept working. That was like, drywall was finished, but there was still tons of work to do, like kitchen cabinet installed. But we just decided, let's just paint it. Let's just make it, bright and nice in here. And so I painted, and knowing that, time was going to come when I would have to paint again, because I would be, scuffing the paint and all that kind of stuff, doing all the rest of the work. So, and I thought I would just put another top coat on, right? Just cover all those scuffs and whatnot. By the time it came to do that top coat, I couldn't get rid of the blues and the blues and the yellows fast enough. And when it was all white, I took like a deep breath and I just relaxed. I guess I didn't realize what an impact those colors were having on me until. But there's a whole science to that, right? And Patrick, I believe, I may be wrong about this, I believe I read that green might be a good color for learning.
I hope it works, Brian, because
But there's a whole science to like how colors, what effect, psychological effect colors have on us when we're surrounded by them all the time. And it's been well studied.
It's fascinating. What I observed is like, okay, your ceiling, no one's touching it. No one's spilling food on it. But gosh, when you put a fresh coat of white paint on it, it looks so much better. And you really cannot tell how gross it is until you repaint.
Unless you're in my house and you've got what seems like mouse pee seeping through it. I still haven't figured out what is going on up there. We'll
talk a little bit about it later, but somebody wrote in who had listened to an older podcast, and you were talking about the stains on your ceiling. I don't know, it was probably a year ago or more, and I guess you're still dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried just about everything I can think of, and it hasn't worked yet. So short of ripping it out.
So my suggestion in that episode was to use an oil primer. Have you tried that?
I did buy some kind of ceiling primer. I haven't put it up there, but yeah, we'll see. That's probably the last thing. And it's sort of like it's kind of spread areas. Like it's even in my office now, and it's in a little spot in the bedroom and a lot of the hallway. So I do want to take care of it.
What have you been doing, Jeff?
Besides podcasts, not a whole lot.
We had a busy week of podcasts with the Builder Show, and it's been a lot of that.
Now I'm playing catch up.
You got any projects going on, Brian?
No, just a lot of work right now.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, the Builder Show was a big push last week, and getting an issue out the door this week. Work's been busy.
It's been busy.
Good. And it's been, I think I've probably said this before on the podcast, but, work has been a source of solace for me over the last year.
Something to do.
It's easy to be grateful for, and it's something to, having a job right now and something to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you guys remember we were talking about lead. We had a listener write in whose experience was that there were few people in his experience and the experience of the person he asked who had shown symptoms of lead accumulation with regard to who knows how they got it, but there was a number of people who wrote in taking us to task for potentially minimizing the effects of lead poisoning. So I'm going to pick one of them here. And it comes from an MD. As a longtime subscriber, I love listening to your show and reading your magazine. Unfortunately, you almost lost me to a heart attack when I listened to the letter about minimizing the importance of lead exposure on show 321. I'm a middle-aged, board-certified pediatrician that is a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I work into the Chicagoland area. I thought some brief background on lead is warranted. The information that follows can be found from sources like the American Academy of Pediatrics or many Department of Public Health websites. Even a small event can harm a child's brain and nervous system. Lead poisoning can slow a child's development and cause learning and behavioral problems. Pregnant women with lead exposure can also harm the developing fetus. There is no safe lead level. It is correct that very few children have high enough lead poisoning to threaten their life or that it is high enough to benefit from chelation therapy. doctors do have treatments to reverse the damage that small amounts of lead had on a child. Lead can also get stored in a child's bones and leach back into the blood over a very long period of time, long after the exposure is gone. A few facts. $17 to $221 are estimated to be saved for every dollar that is invested in a U.S. household to reduce lead exposure. 535,000 estimated U.S. preschool children have a lead level greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. This is a management level. 23 million estimated total loss of IQ points among U.S. children today due to lead exposure. 1 in 5 cases of ADHD are attributed to lead exposure. And he has a bunch of resources that I'll link on our podcast page. He says, and as an aside, I live in a 100-year-old home and read tons of material on all specs of home remodeling, inspection, and building. I am fearless when it comes to any type of project and use them as part of my self-imposed therapy. If you ever want to get the perspective of how a motivated novice would approach some of your listener issues, I'm happy to participate. My recent projects mostly would approach during COVID have been inspired by you, including bringing my walk-up attic with mechanicals into the building envelope, putting a gas vented heater in the garage, adding a 100-amp sub-panel with new electric for car charging, and installing a still-ordered hot tub, moving all the mechanicals for a washer and dryer to have them built in, faux wainscoting over plaster, etc., etc. As you can tell, I have a very patient wife. P.S. Don't use bungee cords. So there you go. So lead is a problem. We didn't mean to minimize it, but I thought the listener, made a good point. Let's see. On this week's episode of the podcast, Matt said of storm windows, what are you going to do? Keep them up all year? In my house, we absolutely keep them up all year. We live in a 1912 Craftsman in Seattle near a busy street, and the storm windows are crucial to reducing the amount of street noise that makes it indoors. Even if we didn't need storm windows for the sound isolation, insulation is still useful year-round unless you have seasons where it's 70 degrees outside day and night. You're still conditioning the space. Also, I'm glad that the previous owners went with exterior storms instead of interior. In my home, the windows are one of the most influential interior design elements. The interior faces of the windows affect my enjoyment of the home and much more since I spent a lot of time looking out my windows and very little time looking in. What do you think, Matt? You convinced?
No, well, I mean, I guess if I lived in a city and I was trying to keep out noise and I had no intention of ever opening my windows, but I mean, for me, like letting the outside in is a big part of my conditioning my house in the spring, summer, and fall. Like as soon as I can turn the heating system off, I do. And then, as much as I can use the outside air to condition my house, in the cooling months, I do. I don't want to run the air conditioner any more than I have to.
Yeah, there you go. Brian, do you have storm windows in your apartment? Do you take them off and put them on?
No. We don't have windows. We have one window that opens.
What?
Yeah.
How is that legal?
That's a great question, Patrick. This house is more out of square and out of plumb than most, as many houses down here in Charleston are. I mean, it's you could walk around the city and it's a very visual thing that the houses are not plumb.
It's because of bad soil. What's going on?
I think that's it. I think it's largely because they're sinking, and there's a little bit of seismic activity down here. The earth is moving, and you can spot it walking down the street. One house after another, and so I'm sure that none of these window openings are left square, and none of the windows budge.
So they're technically operable windows, but they don't operate.
Correct.
Okay.
And I have tried to get them open. It's not like stuck paint.
I wonder how much that glass can handle before that just starts to crack.
Well, and that's a great question, and that's we actually have had, I think we've had 2 broken pieces of glass on the house, and that the landlord has had to fix since we've been here, and that's one of the reasons why I don't try too hard to get the windows open, because it's this old single pane glass, and
right.
I just don't break it in my effort to crack a window. We've won, and the truth is that we don't get much of a season here for open windows anyway. So the one that we can crack is helpful.
Yeah.
This is interesting. This comes from Nicky. Hi, podcast. I'm a 29-year-old guy from Belgium living in New Zealand for a few years. I'm qualified in metal engineering, which I don't like. Do you guys want to take a guess at what that is? I asked Nicky, I emailed him yesterday to get clarification on what that exactly means. But do you think it's like building bridges and skyscrapers and stuff?
No idea.
Well, hopefully Nicky will write back and we'll be able to update folks what that means. I've been listening to the podcast for about 4 months. The last 3 years, I've become obsessed with passive and energy efficient houses. In podcast 267, you asked, what is the problem with the HVAC trade? Kylie said you'd get comments. This is one of them. I have 3 years experience in the HVAC trade in Belgium and 1 in New Zealand, followed by some HVAC schooling. And you guys are right. They only teach us about the air conditioning and heat pump things. Ductwork is minimized. My teacher said once that if the house is uninsulated, don't sell a heat pump. It's useless. That's all he said. If we go to sell a heat pump, we look at the windows, we see how much draft comes through them, we look at the power receptacles to see if there's light around them. This is how we get an indication of how much heat loss we use in the calculation for sizing a unit, but that's all. I try to give my clients the best advice I can, but we need to earn money or I'll be out of work. And in 259, you said, Dunedin, and
Dunedin.
He says, you pronounce it Dunedin.
Yeah.
I live in Queenstown, and it's a 3-hour drive over there. It's a fairly dry climate, and houses are so leaky, even the new builds. And it can get bloody hot because of the really aggressive sun. And most of the new builds have small or no overhangs and massive windows. And it gets bloody hot inside, too. Most people just buy a bigger furnace or heat pump instead of making their house airtight. And by the way, electricity is expensive here. Keep up the good work. Love all the podcasts and the information you give. Kind regards, Nicky. And English isn't my first language, so don't look at my mistakes. What do you think? I love hearing from our international listeners. That's a kind of a cool perspective.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did he learn the trade in Belgium or New Zealand?
It seemed like he's a Belgian resident that moved to New Zealand, so I'm guessing he started there.
Yeah.
Well, he's pointing to something that's important, and that's the fact that the two things of your heating and cooling system, your mechanical system, and your envelope are so tied together, and so interdependent on each other. And so, but often I think in existing houses, and he mentioned new houses too, but in existing houses, you upgrade your heating system or your cooling system, when your old one fails. And so you hurry up and do it. And that's not the time when you're going to be able to think about envelope improvements and how those would affect what you need for heating and cooling and that kind of thing. If you're living in cold climate and your boiler fails, you have to get a new boiler right away. Time to think about air sealing around your windows first so that you can, potentially get a smaller boiler.
Right.
And that's just kind of the way we operate. Fortunately, at least in the building community that Fine Homebuilding is part of, professionals, architects, builders, engineers are now looking at much more closely at and considering the envelope and the mechanicals as one part of one system.
And now we're getting to the point. I'm currently working on a piece. It's my next thing to work on, the need for standalone dehumidification systems, because we've made envelopes really tight in modern housing, and conventional AC systems don't do enough to reduce the latent cooling that reduces humidity. Yeah, sure, it can bring the temperature down, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're comfortable if it's all clammy and wet in there. And it's not good for the building, right?
Right. Yeah, it's that's sort of it's an important thing for people to be. I'm glad we're publishing that story because it's important people to become aware of that. If you don't understand the different cooling loads that your AC takes care of, you might not think about dehumidification. And also, when I got the idea for that article and asked Scott to work on it from a presentation that I saw, I think it was Christoph Irwin, who's an engineer in Austin, Texas, and building scientist actually has the Building Science podcast, which is really an excellent podcast. And he was on with a woman from a company that makes mechanical systems. I can't remember her name right now. And I listened to this podcast, and they also mentioned how climate change is affecting the areas where dehumidification is necessary, and that area, that part of our country is growing. The size of hot humid climates is growing and is anticipated to grow over the next little bit. So if you're building new now, it's something you might need not long from now in your area.
Yeah. I can tell you, in the wintertime, we keep our house 70, right? It's still not comfortable oftentimes, especially if you're sitting in front of our crappy windows, right? But in the summertime, running a couple window air conditioners, they really do a good job managing the latent loads because the system is relatively undersized, right? Like a HVAC contractor would never size what amounts to 10,000 BTUs of cooling for a house of my size, right? It's going to be, a 1.5, 2 ton system minimum, and a ton is worth about 12,000 BTUs of cooling, as I recall. So you can't buy a system small enough,
right?
But I can be comfortable in our house at 75 degrees because the humidity is around the 50% point. So it's pretty interesting how comfort is more than temperature.
Yeah.
Patrick, maybe you should explain the difference between sensible and latent loads, since we're using that term, and I don't know that it's
widely understood.
Common jargon.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. Sensible loads refer to cooling load, making the air temperature cooler. Latent load is referring to humidity control, and it's not more complicated than that. And you have to manage both, and oftentimes it's not complementary with the equipment. There's too much sensible cooling to effectively manage latent cooling loads because systems are oversized, and like I mentioned earlier, they're badly designed.
Yeah. And the issue, I don't know if you really got to this, but when the system is oversized, it's only running for a couple minutes to get that temperature down, but it's not cycling the air enough to be able to take the water out of it. So it's getting to the temperature it thinks it wants to be at, but it's much better if that system is sized down so that it's running constantly so that it can constantly deal with that moisture.
If anyone out there is listening, in the HVAC equipment arena, equipment with variable refrigerant flow is slowly getting adopted into the marketplace, and these systems will actually speed up and slow down to more effectively match sensible and latent loads. If any of you out there know folks who are familiar with this equipment and are knowledgeable enough to write an article for Fine Homebuilding, I think it's something we really need to tackle in the near future because this stuff is way more complicated, but also more useful than conventional systems.
Yeah.
Should we get to some questions?
Do it.
Brian from Boise writes in, I have an air sealing and insulation question, but in order to pique your interest, I should mention that it does involve brick. My house in Boise, Idaho, a very dry climate, Zone 5, was built in 1955 as a ranch-style house with brick veneer on the east-facing wall. It is by far the coldest of the walls in my house, and I was planning on doing something about it from the interior relative to air sealing and insulation. My initial idea for an assembly followed the one suggested by Brian Pontilillo's Walls That Work webinar video with rigid foam that stood off from the interior of the sheathing and caulked or taped to the studs for air sealing, followed by either fiberglass bats or possibly blown-in cellulose. However, in inspecting the existing wall assembly further, I discovered a double layer of 6 mil polyethylene behind the building paper on the exterior and in direct contact with the board sheathing. This is where I get confused. My thinking is that the polyethylene barrier prevents drying to the outside. Should the sheathing get wet, either through vapor drive from the brick or interior, or just general sloppiness in the assembly, which means I need drying potential to the inside, which then means that the rigid foam on the interior is a bad idea. With that in mind, would a bond fig assembly with mineral bats followed by a fully detailed smart vapor retarder, such as Signa's Madrex on the interior for an air barrier behind the drywall, be a better assembly? Or am I overthinking this whole thing and can follow through with the original plan of Mr. Pontilillo's aforementioned assembly with rigid foam, faced polyiso, for example, followed up by my choice of fluffy insulation? As much as I'd love a warm wall, I'd prefer a cold one without mold and rot, so if it's an inherently risky proposition, that'd be great to know as well. Thanks for taking the time to make the podcast every week. It's carried me through more projects than I can count and helped me educate and move me from someone who put 5 unsealed can lights in the ceiling just 4 years ago to someone who was willing, albeit begrudgingly, to pay for Swiss-made air sealing products. Take care and kind regards from Boise, Brian. P.S. I fixed the can lights, should anyone ask. Oh my God. So I have never seen poly on the exterior side of sheathing. Have you guys heard of this ever?
No, with one caveat. I think it's possible that the poly is just at the bottom of the wall, sort of as like in the place of flashing. And so it's just kind of like protecting the bottom of that, cavity, behind the brick. And it may only run up like 4 or 8 inches or something like that. It's sort of like,
this is an assembly you know of, Matt? Have you heard of this?
I've heard of it only like in people asking questions about it on GBA and other forums, like that they've opened up walls and seen that and been like, what is this?
Do you know if the housing is from the same era as Brian's house?
I have no idea, but it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know. I mean, living in a house of that vintage, people took a lot of shortcuts, I will say. And so rather than having like a proper through wall flashing, they may have used, poly to sort of like keep water away from the sheathing and stuff at the bottom of that, airspace behind the brick.
So let's talk about this in 2 ways then. So assuming it doesn't go all the way up, would that affect how you detail the interior of this assembly?
Yeah, for sure. For me, it would anyway. I don't know. Not knowing a whole lot about how, vapor is being driven to this wall or anything, I would be much more conservative if I thought the poly went all the way up the wall. Yeah.
Because there's no drying.
The only drying potential is to the inside. So you have to leave that avenue open. Yeah.
How about you, Brian? Have you heard of this?
I have not heard of the poly on the exterior like that. But I also think that we should address his 2 proposed assemblies, because I think that if I'm reading the drawing that he sent right, there is an airspace between the brick and the sheathing, and there's either just felt or felt and poly over this wall. So there's a WRB. So that gap that he's thinking of creating inside the wall assembly here is unnecessary. No matter what he does, he doesn't need to do that. That suggestion is for a wall that either doesn't have an air gap, like a reservoir cladding without an air gap, or a house without a WRB.
I'm going to stop you and ask a question. So the building scientists tell us that, brick assemblies from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, unless they're really consciously detailed, the mortar droppings from laying brick end up clogging the bottom of the airspace behind the brick meant to provide drainage and drying. Would you be concerned about that, Brian?
I mean, if it's that can be investigated, right? I mean, if it's really blocking airflow through that cavity, then then the cavity becomes sort of
unhelpful.
But if that cavity is open and has airflow, then basically he can insulate his wall without being concerned about that gap, having that gap in there. But to Matt's point, he needs to make this whole thing, a gap isn't what he needs for drying. He needs this whole assembly assuming that there's poly over the whole wall for now, to be on the safe side, he needs this whole assembly to be able to dry inward, right?
Right.
I think the bond fig wall with a smart or variable perm vapor retarder seems like a pretty good idea. I might even keep it more vapor open than that. If there really is poly over the whole wall, maybe consider not even just airtight drywall on the inside. Because if it's poly, you really only, you have no outward drying potential.
Right.
Yeah.
So the wall has to be able to dry inward, and so I don't think he needs the airspace in the cavity. And
in the stud cavity, we
in
should
the stud
clarify.
cavity,
Yeah.
I think I like the idea of the bond fig wall because he's in a cold climate. It gives him more insulation and a bit of a thermal break. And I agree with Matt, like make sure that you have as much drying potential as possible to the inside.
I was thinking like just not putting anything in the cavities except maybe a bunch of packets of like silica gel, and then using and then using like Gutex over the studs, and then put your drywall over that. So you have an interior layer of vapor open insulation.
Matt, I think you just invented a product.
Desiccant insulation is a fantastic
for wall assembly
idea. Yes.
Drill little holes, drop it in.
Yep. Done.
Be done with it.
I don't know. In a wet season, you might have that stuff start to pop the drywall off the interior, right? It's a really good question. I think Brian has some things going for him. He's in a really dry climate. Brick is less risky in places where it's dry generally than when it's wet, right?
Yeah.
And solar vapor drive is a big concern with brick, but if it's poly on there and there's an airspace, there's no way that solar vapor drive is going to, get into the sheathing or the, stud cavities. So
hopefully he has overhangs. Hopefully it's good flashing. If that stuff's, if the sheathing's not getting wet from rain.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big difference. Yeah. Cause he said a ranch, right? I mean, this would be a big difference. It would be a big difference if this was a cape, with like no overhangs. But.
Right.
Or 3 stories tall, right? That's another thing. I'm sure that wasn't helpful at all, Brian, but Hello, FHB. My son's nursery and our guest room share a common 2x4 stud wall with 1/2-inch drywall on both sides. Needless to say, sound transfer between the two rooms is an issue. The worst offender is the cold air return in the guest room, which is formed by the stud cavity. There's no ductwork, and it has high and low vents that are open and closed depending on the season. I'd like to cut a 4-foot wide strip in the drywall across the guest room and install rock wool, safe and sound, for the majority of the wall. What else should I do to reduce noise transfer across the cold air return cavity? Simple, easily to source solutions would be appreciated. And this is from Eric in Adamstown, Pennsylvania. So ductworks in interior walls that are shared by two spaces are a huge conduit for sound. That is like the worst thing you can do. You're putting this pipe that connects the spaces, right? What do you guys, I don't know what to say here, but I'm going to let you guys figure it out, and then I'll chime in and criticize you.
Well, only thing I came up was moving it.
Yeah. Same. Like I was thinking, just cut holes in the floor on both sides and duct it through that way. I mean, if it's just going through that stud bay, you can kind of connect it, in this, offset a few inches on either side of that and just plug up all those holes in the wall. I don't know.
It's one of the hardest things to deal with, and acousticians tell you to not do this, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't stop people from doing it. I don't know. It's a hard thing.
You could double up the drywall on the walls. That might help.
But it's not going to help this return. I think, people have a misconception about how to stop sound, and I don't know if it's the insulation industry that is, popularize these myths, but like fluffy things don't do a good job of stopping sound. You actually want like dense, flexible materials like mass-loaded vinyl to stop sound. And there are mass-loaded vinyls that you could wrap around this conduit, your return air duct, to try and stop the sound from transferring through the drywall to the other room, and I think that might be your best bet. But it's a very difficult thing to solve.
Yeah, I'll be interested if he's willing to write back to us and hear how the Safe and Sound insulation, which is a rock wool product, right? That is so it's mineral wool bats that are meant to help with just this.
And I think they're higher density than most insulations. Is that correct?
I think that's how they work. Yeah. And so I'd be curious to get some, and I know that I know of a lot of new homes that they're going into, but it'd be really interesting to hear from someone who can kind of have a before and after opinion on its effectiveness.
I've got one question for this guy. Like, this is a guest room. Why are you having guests in a pandemic? Like, you don't really need sound isolation to a guest room when you're not supposed to be having guests.
I thought the simple solution was to bring the crib into your own bedroom when you have guests, right? And just eliminate the whole problem. But I understand the issue there.
But it might be the guests that are the problem.
Right, they're keeping the kid up.
Maybe might be the one complaining here. I don't know what kind of guests he's having over.
Yeah,
they're in there partying, keeping his little kids up. Eric, once again, I'm sure that was not helpful at all, but it's a hard thing to solve.
One. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah. I think your best bet is to try and separate the two spaces with some kind of mass-loaded vinyl in that stud cavity that's being used as a return. There's no easy answer to that one. Hello, FHB podcast. I heard somewhere, this is from our friend Doug Horgan. I heard somewhere on the inner tubes that the code is changing to allow universal one-step glue on PVC drain lines. I've also had conversations in the past where some enterprising plumber was trying to save 5 minutes by skipping the primer on PVC pipe. Is the code changing? And if you're very risk averse and want a top quality job, should you stick to using a purple primer anyway, i.e. is it better? Good question, Doug. So my understanding is the 2015 IRC did allow you to stop using primer on PVC solvent welded joints for pipes that were non-pressurized and smaller than 4 inches in diameter. And Doug, if you want to read along, it is provision P3003.9.2, and that's in the plumbing section, obviously, and that's where you'll find details about that. Matt, didn't you dive into this with a Q&A?
I don't remember that one. No.
Matt, don't you think you should dive into this for a Q&A?
Probably should. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what inspectors are looking for. You know?
We lost you, Brian. What's going on with your sound?
You got muted.
Oh, here we go. What'd you say, Brian?
I said the problem is that we usually go to Doug for answers to questions like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think good plumbers are still using primer because I think it makes for a better connection, right? It's actually softening the plastic so the cement does a deeper bond is how I understand it, is the chemistry of it. Am I making that up, Matt?
I don't think you're making that up, but I mean, the fact that it's limited in its use, you can get away without using primer for certain connections, but not others. I think that's because, some of those connections are, you're talking about non-pressure connections. So, it's
you're talking about waste and vents, right?
It's not as vital because, it's all going one direction. Like, it's not like it's under pressure and it's under risk of seeping out through those joints necessarily. A lot of that stuff you might be able to get away without glue, as long as it's held together somehow. You could tape around it and it might still work.
Podcast listeners, do not listen to Matt. You absolutely have to glue your drain waste vent system.
I'm not saying you don't want to. You definitely want to.
Is it really a huge time and money saver to not use primer?
No.
No.
It's silly. It's silly not to do it. But
I know some plumbers don't like the mess of it. They think it detracts from their work, right? It looks messy. But I think if you get good at it, you make less mess. I get stuff everywhere.
Use some painter's tape. tape a nice line around the pipe.
Yeah, these are people that just are not willing to take the time to make it look right. No.
It's messy. It
is messy.
It's really messy.
Stuff. Yeah.
I think the short answer is the code has changed. You don't necessarily have to use the purple primer on your DWV system, but I think your local inspector is not necessarily going to be on board. And that's that's where the rubber hits the road, right? Is you have to be permitted by your local official to do whatever.
Yeah. What are they going to do? Start coloring the glue? Like, how do you even know that the glue, how do you even know that the joint is connected at all if you're an inspector?
Or a plumber. I mean, it's really easy to get, gluing a bunch of fittings and skip one, right? You take a phone call, you take your lunch break or whatever. Like, at least for me, it's a check that you've,
Yeah.
I mean, you can see the glue too, but it's definitely not as obvious as the purple primer.
Yeah.
I learned in researching this a little bit yesterday that there's also clear primer, and some places you're allowed to use that with some inspectors, and that solves the messiness that some plumbers dislike. This comes from Susanna. Hey, podcast. I'm an early career building envelope engineer in Boston. Have you guys ever heard of this? Building envelope engineer?
I have heard of building envelope specialists and building envelope engineers. I think, though, mostly in commercial construction.
And that might be what Susanna does. I'm not sure. I love listening to your podcast at work during drafting projects so I can learn more about my field and test my knowledge. Also, I've been really appreciating the variety of voices in your Pro Talk. I'm not a homeowner, but a friend asked for my expert opinion about supporting a countertop recently, so I thought I would reach out to you. My friend is a new homeowner and has been trying for months to get their dishwasher installed next to their existing cabinets. They finally figured out how to install an end panel themselves after no contractor in the Buffalo area would take on a job that small. They purchased some butcher block to go over the dishwasher, but are now being told that there is no way to install it without replacing the entire adjacent countertop. You can see in the photo that a new piece of countertop would currently only be supported on one side by the end panel, which is a no-go for obvious reasons. My friend understands this now, but is hoping to figure out a way to support the new piece without replacing what's already there over the existing cabinets. Is this situation hopeless? I was thinking that they might be able to mirror the end panel next to the existing cabinet so the new piece is supported like an island, but they are thinking that some kind of L brackets might work like a floating shelf. As someone who's studied structural engineering, I have my doubts about finding a bracket that is up to the task of supporting a heavy, dynamically loaded countertop, especially one small enough to allow a dishwasher to fit underneath. Any ideas, or should my friend resign themselves to a full countertop replacement? I'm not sure this fulfills the fine and fine home building, but my friend does genuinely care about their home and wants to do their best. If it helps spark some interest, their home also features Yankee gutters, which I use the FHB website to help them look up after their inspection.
Cool.
What are Yankee gutters? Is that where the board sticks up, or are they box gutters, built-in gutters?
I've always thought they were wooden gutters. Just that sort of V-shaped wooden gutter.
Maybe I should look that up in Fine Homebuilding.
Maybe you should. She could also be referring to built-in gutters, though, that are within the roof line, so that they kind of disappear.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, but I didn't even look it up. That was my assumption was those ones that are sort of in the roof almost. And
Yeah.
I've heard a couple things described as Yankee gutters, and like you guys, we called them box gutters in Pittsburgh, which were built into the eave, right? And then it lined with usually tin.
Yeah.
And the other thing I've seen are like a 2x4 put on edge that's put on the eave and wrapped in tin, and that's a bad idea in any place it snows because it's just holding snow and ice on the roof, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I've done this thing recently. You guys may have noticed in my kitchen remodel. So I left the existing countertop, but I wanted to add another drawer base. So what I did is I screwed a cleat to the existing end panel that supports one end of the countertop, and then on the other end is the the plywood that holds up, plywood end panel that holds up the other end. And, my has a cabinet in there, but it would be the same if you put a dishwasher in there. And I think if you got some, heavy L bracket, like the kind that is used to hold up the tracks for garage doors with a bunch of holes in it, and screw that to the existing end panel to underneath the countertop, I think that would hold up the one side. And then it's thin, so the dishwasher would still be able to fit in there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, was just like a aluminum angle, like a 1x1 aluminum angle in there, and just screw it to the side of that cabinet, and it will carry that other ends just fine. And the thing that made me think about that is Michael Maines did something like that on a project that was in the magazine, I don't know, 3 or 4 issues ago, maybe, I think. So it wasn't the exact same thing, but it was in an island where they needed to fit. I can't remember if it was a dishwasher or a range or something like that in there, but it was the same concept.
What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, the cleat seemed really obvious to me. Just glue and screw a cleat to the adjacent cabinet. It seemed so obvious to me that I wondered if maybe that the space, there was no tolerance there for it, and the dishwasher needed all that space.
Right.
If that's the case, then I still think, like Matt just said, I still think a bracket would do fine there. Metal bracket's super strong.
And thin. It needs to,
and thin. So, yeah, I think either one of those solutions should work.
What do you think, Jeff?
My only concern is what that end panel on that cabinet is made of.
It was plywood.
Is it quarter-inch plywood? I mean, is it?
Oh, right. So you're saying if you want to screw a metal bracket to the end panel of the existing cabinet, it better be something sturdy enough to hold it. And if it's quarter-inch plywood, that's probably not going to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Without backing it up with something else.
Right. Yeah. And then you can just glue a piece of like 1/2 or 3/4 plywood strip in there to screw into.
Yeah. And maybe a cleat on the back wall too.
Mm-hmm.
I totally think a cleat on the back wall is great because now you're supporting two sides very well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Susanna, thank you for that. All right, here's a question that might have an answer. And this comes from Patrick in Sandy Hook, Connecticut.
I wonder who that is. I only know one Patrick in Sandy Hook, Connecticut.
So I don't know if you guys have seen the back of my house, but I have a moss problem on my shingles. And it's not over the entire roof, but on half of it, it's shaded a lot of the year by a huge catalpa tree that is my Moby Dick of vegetation in my landscape. Mm-hmm. But the moss is unsightly, and I wondered if it's also damaging the roof. So I emailed my buddy Diami Plotke of Roof Services, and I said, what do you guys tell clients who are concerned about the moss on their roofs? And here's what he wrote back. The first thing we tell customers who have moss on their roof is to leave it. While it may cause an aesthetic issue, on in the most severe cases or on the worst condition roofs, does it cause a watertight issue? Usually the cure is worse than the disease. So he's saying getting it off there is more likely to damage the shingles than just leaving it alone. That said, when customers insist, we recommend copper or zinc strips if they have the patience, or a low pressure power washing with the understanding that it must be sprayed from the top down and may cause damage. We've never tried spray and forget. So this was Mike Gurton's suggestion, which is a home center product. Comes in a bottle and you mix it with water. Yeah, it works well, right?
Yeah.
It worked well for me for killing the moss, but it didn't remove the moss.
So you had brown moss then on your roof instead of green moss.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
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 As for avoiding moss in the first place, new GAF shingles, since they bought Elk a few years ago, are much better than they used to be. Also, I've heard wonderful things about the performance of Atlas shingles with Scotchgard. Yes, Scotchgard from 3M. We've only installed a handful over the years as most customers have higher priorities than moss, but my distributors swear by Atlas shingles when moss is an issue. On another note, I'm eager to read the recent article on Slate. I'm hoping you guys got it right. You'll have to tell us, Diami. I'm sure you will.
He'll be sure to tell us.
So you've had this problem, Brian.
Yeah, and interestingly, I had a roof that when I bought the house had a tremendous amount. The north facing roof, which first of all was a lesson in how roofs perform with different exposures, because we had bought the house with probably maybe a 20-year-old roof on it, and a south facing pitch that gets sunlight for a good part of the day, was in great shape. Probably had another 20 years left. And the north-facing pitch that was in the shade was covered with moss. The shingles were curled. The roof looked terrible. Looked like it needed to be replaced immediately. That said, I didn't replace it immediately, and I lived in the house for quite a long time without doing anything about the moss, and never had a leak or a problem due to the moss. I just didn't remove it because my intention was to replace the roof. It just didn't happen very quickly. I did replace the roof with. Eventually, I did replace the roof with new shingles, and ignorantly didn't do anything about the fact that moss grew on the roof, and I knew that was going to happen. I didn't put in any zinc or copper strips or anything like that, and I didn't use a roof product with microbial protection. And I had moss in no time, almost instantly. I think I was putting in the top course, and the moss was growing on the first course.
It was following you up the roof.
And that's when I tried the product. And like I said, my experience was that it with the moss that I had, that the moss died, but didn't. It was going to take some sort of physical effort to remove it from the roof, which points to exactly what Dehumi's talking about, is that effort damages the shingles. It's really hard to scrub or scrape a shingle without scraping away the
granules,
the surface. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I could get mine off with a push broom, but like when I've been up there cleaning the gutters, I've, poked at pieces of it, and you can pull it off readily. But like you said, it pulls off the granules, and that's like not what you want, right?
Right.
That's the sun protection that, and pollution protection that, for the shingle. It's the wear layer, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you have moss on your roof, Matt? Do you care?
I don't have any on this roof. It's relatively new. It was put in 2016, I think, the year before we bought the house. So I haven't noticed any yet. But it's a relatively low slope roof. The house faces directly south, and the north side. I mean, we definitely get a lot of stuff on the siding on the north side, and I spray that with spray and forget all the time. But
how long does that last for you?
I have been doing it pretty much every year. I would say it doesn't last a year, probably.
And your siding is vinyl, right?
Yeah. But yeah, it gets all green and funky if I don't.
Jeff, you have a lot of tree cover on the back of your house. Do you have moss and algae growing on your roof shingles?
Yeah, I do, and lichen too.
I bet you're not liking it.
No, I am not.
Do you intend to do anything about it?
No, not really. I mean, I'm hopefully we get another 10 years out of the roof, but I mean, it's almost 20 years old, so.
Would you use one of these shingle products for the re-roof?
I would definitely think about it.
Yeah. I should ask Dehumi if there's a big price difference between, conventional shingles and these others that are better at this problem, better at dealing with this problem. It can't be too much difference, I'm guessing. So what do you guys have planned for your weekend projects? You go first, Jeff. Do you have anything upcoming?
No, not really. All my projects are big and expensive, so they're all on hold.
How about you, Matt?
Still working on that breezeway project. Got back to that. So I built most of the doors for the cabinets. There's just one door left that I have to build that's big, but all small ones. So I got to paint those this weekend. So
are you working in your garage wood shop? Have you gotten that set up to where it's a functional workspace?
Well, I'm using it. I wouldn't say it's necessarily functional exactly, because there's so much stuff. Every time I use a tool, I have to move a bunch of stuff to be able to access it. And I only put in one 240 volt receptacle. So, I've got 3 tools that need it. So actually last weekend made myself a 240 extension cord so that I can run that.
So you can leave your machinery in the same place, but plug it in.
And then, I got it. So that was fun, but it works fine.
Do you have a sub panel in there?
Yeah, there is. I don't know. I still got to figure out what's going on that sub panel. There's like a 50 amp breaker going to I don't know what. So,
well, that's your table saw
no
circuit, right?
No, well, I put in another breaker for the table saw circuit, but there was an existing 50 amp that goes I don't know where. I don't know what it could possibly go to. So I know it's not to the well. There's another breaker in the main panel for that, but
well, that would be an insanely huge pump, right? You know,
yeah.
50 amps is like maybe they had a welder or something like that. You know, that's a lot of juice.
It's possible. I haven't found the receptacle or whatever it goes to yet. I haven't traced it, so I'll find it eventually.
So there's drywall or some kind of paneling in that space?
Yeah, most of the garage is drywalled. So, yeah.
Well, that's kind of nice. That's going to make it more comfortable in there.
Yeah, except it's the one wall that is like has the most exposure mostly isn't drywalled. So, and there's no drywall on the ceiling, and it's a vented assembly. So it's pretty much as cold as it is outside.
It's outside.
Yeah.
Do you have plans to cover the ceiling?
Yeah, it's just trying to figure out exactly how I'm going to do that because, it's 26-foot span and, that's the ties that are in there, or the ceiling joists, I guess, are spaced 4 foot on center. So I can't really attach drywall to it safely. And so, I got to find some other 26-foot 2x6s.
That's going to be a challenge.
I don't know where you get that these days. So
I think you buy LVL, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Brian, you got anything planned for the weekend?
Some rest from the last couple of weeks, and then probably some more work. How's that sound?
That's how it goes.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate all of the folks who send in questions to the podcast today and throughout the year. It's how we do the show. And so if you all have a question, be sure to send them in. And if you have any comments on the show, do that too. We pay attention to everything you all send in. And I apologize if you don't hear from us. There's just too much to respond to every piece of email that we get, but know that we are listening and paying attention. So
yeah. And article ideas, I can't seem to tell people enough, readers and listeners, that our articles come from our audience often. They come from people out in the field doing the work. So if you've ever thought about wanting to write an article for us or like the idea of it, be in touch. We want to hear from you.
Amen. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Brian, Matt, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Stay safe, happy building, keep craft alive.